Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you're located. We are pleased to welcome you to the Washington Labs Academy webinar series. We hope you'll find the next hour or so useful and informative. We've developed our webinar series to deal with some of the technical and administrative issues that our customers face on a day-to-day basis. We recognize that engineering challenges can be complex, and we're always looking for ways to support the technology industry. Before we begin, I want to go over a few housekeeping details. First, I hope everyone can see the title slide on your computer. This presentation is part of our webinar series presented this calendar year. This particular subject is dealing with wireless. We have muted everyone's microphones, make the meeting quality as high as possible. The recording of the presentation is underway and will be sent to all registered attendees along with a copy of the presentation. A training certificate is sent to the attendees of the live presentation. A full screen view may be preferred. Just select View and Full Screen, and Escape will allow you to return to the normal view. We encourage questions during the presentation. You can submit a question by enabling the chat or Q&A icon at the top or side of your screen and typing your question to the host. We will go through all the questions at the end of the presentation as time permits. I will not interrupt the speaker during the presentation for questions. I'd like to hear from you. You can reach out to us at academy@wll.com or the speaker directly, as you can see on the screen, Tim Johnson, timj@acbcert.com. We estimate that the main bulk of the presentation will take approximately an hour and will allow some time for questions at the end. I'd like to introduce our speaker. Tim Johnson is Senior Certification Engineer for American Certification Body and a non-already certified engineer both for EMC and wireless device certification professional disciplines. Tim has been with ACB since November 2001 and has over 22 years in the testing and certification industry and has reviewed and certified thousands of devices across the technology spectrum. He's developed techniques and procedures for FCC, IFCD, formerly Industry Canada, and Japan MIC requirements. He launched American Certification Body's operation in Taiwan and has overseen audit and surveillance programs and contributed to quality system for compliance with ISO Guide 65 for certification bodies. Tim has served as a member of the TCB Council Executive Board from 2007 to 2009 and TCB Council Education Committee member for several years thereafter. Tim, welcome. Let me get your presentation up and get you control. Tim, you should be able to do this. Let me get your sound check.
Yes, good morning.
It's very nice. Thank you. Welcome.
Well, good morning to those in attendance from North America, or if you're attending from elsewhere, good evening, good afternoon, depending where you're hailing from. Despite this being an introductory presentation, I've tried to provide some slides with takeaway value, especially for those that might be learning and educating themselves about FCC or IC rules and regulations, and it might be new to them. Each of you should be receiving a copy of the presentation afterwards, as Steve mentioned, and will hopefully provide a bit more detail that you can look at a later time or ask questions from later. Therefore, I have a lot to cover because I put together a pretty large presentation here. We're going over each of the topics pretty quickly and trying to maintain an hour. Basically, we're covering an introduction to FCC rules, how to access information on the FCC site, grants and authorizations, quick comparisons to Canada, some information about permissive changes, an introduction to transmitter modules, and RF exposure, MPE and SAR, just briefly mentioned with some references identified. We try to cover this in an hour. However, each one of these topics could easily be an hour with RF exposure, especially being almost an entire day or more in some cases. Anyway, for those who are trying to sell in the market for the U.S., one of the big questions is this fuss with FCC that they commonly hear from their vendors and everything really necessary? And sadly, the answer to that is going to be yes. You spend a lot of your time marketing or making a good product, but then you want to go market it and then you find out about FCC. There's various government agencies. There's the FCC, FAA, FDA, EPA, are just a few that you have to meet their requirements prior to placing a product on the market. In general, they're their requirements must be met prior to placing in the market. Sometimes there's special cases and things that are usually incorporated into the rules. But in general, the rule of thumb is just to think that you have to meet it ahead of time. There are some other things that you may have to meet. They're not necessarily required by the government agencies. There's safety, there's reliability, PTCRB testing and such for cellular phones. Many of those are requirements that are going to be spelled out by your vendors. The FCC doesn't necessarily regulate quality on concerns. They're usually concerned with interference. Just a little background for the FCC, for those who may not be that familiar with it. Originally established by the Communications Act in 1934. They are directly responsible to Congress with 5 commissioners. They have jurisdiction in the 50 states of the U.S., plus also the possessions in District of Columbia. The Radio Communications Act has 2 main sections that establish some of their authority. There's Section 301 that basically mentions that transmitters in general must be licensed except for under certain circumstances or conditions. And then Section 302 authorizes the FCC to regulate these devices and devices that can create interference potential. The FCC themselves are actually organized into many different divisions and bureaus depending on what you're dealing with. Here, what we're going to be focusing on is going to be the Office of Engineering and Technology. That's the division that usually deals with equipment authorizations. In other words, the equipment has to be tested and shown an authorization of compliance before it's placed in the market. Many of these other bureaus deal with different aspects of media relations. There's also the Homeland Security issues. There's licensing of licenses established for, or licensed devices that have to be established for RF communications, and so forth. Here, we're really focusing on the equipment itself and what it has to meet. The basic responsibility of that particular branch of the OET is given here on this page. We're going to be concentrating mostly on managing equipment authorization programs and their warehousing of the grants and equipment authorizations that is available to the public. They do a lot of other things as well. They do manage the table of allocations given in Part 2 of the rules. They do regulate unlicensed devices and conduct engineering technical studies and things that are needed for changes to rules in the future. In short, the majority of the FCC requirements all come under what's called as Title 47 of the Code of Federal Regulations. Title 47 is telecommunications. They publish an annual edition. I've provided some links here. The link for the annual edition, usually they go out and start publishing around October, but what they do is they start with Title 1. And of course, Title 47 takes some time to get to, so many times that's not available to like January, February of the next year. And more or less, that's a snapshot of it as it goes to press from the October time frame. There are electronic versions that are found online that most of us that deal with the FCC regularly on a daily basis try to go to the electronic rules. I provided a link for that here as well. Unfortunately, this is not considered a legal edition of the rules, even though they are updated daily. Essentially, the rule changes can come about at any given time. They try to publish those and keep them up to date through the electronic system. We have found errors on some occasions, but essentially what you want to do if you want to ensure that you got the absolute accurate version is I would suggest start off with the electronic version. Compare it to the printed edition. If there are changes in the meantime and you want to make sure that they're done right, you sometimes have to go back through the public documents, the report and orders and things that are released as part of the changes to the rules and make sure everything was codified correctly. Essentially, the FCC rules are hard to change. Many of us, depending who you are, feel they're not fun to read. I think the majority of them, over time, were developed through lawyers or written by lawyers. So we feel like we're reading lawyerese, so to speak. Making changes to the rules typically require a period of time of review. The FCC will issue a notice of proposed rulemaking for public comment. It has to be out for a period of time. They usually have to wait for public comment. They usually go through all the requirements, compare them to the comments, arrive at a decision, and eventually issue a updated report that's going to change the rules. In some cases they decide not to change the rules. And occasionally they issue second notice of proposed rulemaking and things like that. So sometimes it can go on for a period of time, even years, but it's a fairly lengthy process that does involve public comment and allowances for you to put your opinion in there if it's something that affects you. In general, the FCC rules, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, are not really there to address quality issues. They're not there to address immunity, as you might be used to for Europe, and also product safety. Generally, the 47 CFR covers a lot of different things. It covers organization structure, allocation tables, Part 2 of the rules, administrative rules on like how to do authorizations, a lot of the specifications and transmitter specifications, the radio service information, EMC specifications. They cover telco devices, telephone terminal equipment. They usually mention test methods by reference in most cases. In some cases, that's not even directly in the rules. Equipment authorization requirements, in other words, how do you proceed to get it on the market? What kind of authorizations do you have to do once you've, complete test data and everything else? They provide guidance on marketing and importation rules, because a lot of people ask, I'm not exactly ready to put it in the market yet. Can I actually put a sample out there to test it and things like that? And in general, the rules are divided into 101 sections, but many of them are not used, and it's reserved for later use. This is just a brief overview of the main common ones that we see. It's not every one that is in existence today, but essentially the CFR contains a lot of these various things. The ones in red are the more common ones that we deal with daily, so I want to just kind of go over that. Part 2 is where you get some of your general information regarding transmitter requirements. That's some of your marketing requirements are in there, your allocation tables that are allowed for licensed devices and things like that. Also your authorizations and how to proceed forth with different authorizations, the type of documents that are required for those, some basic minimum tests that need to be done in most types of transmitters, and things like that are in Part 2. Part 15 is a common section of the rules that we hear about for unlicensed devices. Generally speaking, that covers a lot of the stuff that you can go out as a consumer and buy in the market, as well as devices that are not necessarily even transmitters. Cellular devices typically fall under Part 22 and 24, depending on the frequency bands of operation. Also Part 27, just to throw it out, LTE tends to cover all three of those, depending on what bands of operation the devices are capable of. Part 90 is another common one we see. We, for instance, as a certifier, we deal with all these different sections of the rules, plus some that may not be listed. However, I'm just trying to cover the more common ones that we see for most devices here. Essentially, the rules, just to kind of give you a breakdown, they usually provide you the parameters or requirements that devices need to meet to avoid interference, usually with limits or like power outputs, bandwidths, frequency allocations, and things like that. But even with all the details given in the rules, including the test procedures and so forth, they're not complete in themselves in many cases, because there's room for interpretation, or there's questions like, my device doesn't quite meet this. What tests do I perform? Or there's no test equipment available for this. What do I do? So these rules, as they are, despite the fact that they provide most of the parameters, a lot of the test methods are referenced, and a lot of opinions and things. The FCC has been able to develop an equipment knowledge database that's developed over time, and that's where you can go to do research on your types of devices and maybe inquire with the FCC even for future questions that you may have. It doesn't supersede the rules. Essentially, it's meant to kind of be paired with the rules, but it does provide a lot more detail in a lot of cases. Just to throw out, for instance, Wi-Fi, a lot of people are familiar with, of course. They can follow different test methods and procedures, and the FCC has at least one document that they have published that gives details on DTS test procedures that are acceptable, in addition to other procedures that are already published and accepted through common ANSI C63 standards. So anyway, this system here, here's a link to it, fcc.gov/lab-help. Essentially, you can go there if you have any questions regarding your devices. The FCC helps provide you guidance. Sometimes it's cryptic when they respond. I'll go ahead and say if you get first response, you don't get what you expect, to go back with further details and maybe follow up with them. If you're asking questions to the FCC through their KDB system, expect that the first round of responses is typically provided back to you from an administrative personnel. Typically what they'd like to do is spoon feed you back the actual rules from like the CFR 47 that you have to meet, and they many times will not provide any details further than what the rules themselves cite. But many times what your purpose is of communicating with them, of course, is to try to provide better guidance. What do I do? How do I do it? Or something to that effect, and you have to go back on round 2 before usually it gets to a technical person many times. In short, the FCC rules, a lot of us on a daily basis talk transmitters. A lot of that comes from the fact that the majority of the regulation that requires authorizations for a certification body, for us, for instance, tends to be transmitters themselves. The other devices, non-intentional transmitters, typically have different authorizations that can be followed. They can be certified in some instances. Sometimes there's options in those. But in short, just to summarize it, the rules themselves cover unintentional transmitters and intentional transmitters. The unintentional is devices that are typically wired or not wireless. A computer without any Wi-Fi in it, for instance, or Bluetooth would be an example. Receivers themselves, other types of equipment, even your equipment that's maybe a garage door opener, receiver. Of course, let me think here real quick. A device that's part of a security panel that attaches to a window or door, depending on its frequency of operation, has no wireless in it, would have no receiver in it, but still be subject to Part 15, usually under their 15 subpart C, 15 subpart B, as a non-intentional radiator, depending on the type of circuits that are in it. There are some definitions we have to look at for that. Generally speaking, transmitters themselves fall into 2 broad categories. There's licensed and there's unlicensed. The unlicensed parts tend to fall under rules that are found under the CFR in Part 15 and also in Part 18 for ISM-specific types of equipment. There are a few other subparts that didn't list here. There's Part 11 that covers emergency alert systems specifically, and maybe some others. But generally speaking, most of the time what we hear is Part 15 referenced. Occasionally Part 18, depending what you're doing. So some examples of devices that would typically fall under these are given here. You see garage door openers, key fobs, typical Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, Zigbee types of devices you would typically see off the shelf in most cases. Licensed devices typically fall under a majority of the other rule parts above Part 2. The common ones we see are Part 22, 24, 27, and 90 that we mentioned earlier. There are others, such as Part 101, Part 25, that cover specific types of communications. Part 25, typically, just to throw it out, deals with satellite type of devices and whatnot. So here we have some examples. The non-cellular even covers under general mobile radio services, personal mobile cellular radio services, broadcast radio services, microwave radio services, maritime and aviations. These are different sections of the rules typically that are services that are licensed. So one of the common questions we typically get is what rule part or where does my device fall under the rules? And that's difficult to do, sometimes do, depending on the type of device. Usually somebody with experience is very helpful to talk to. But what you can always do if you're trying to do it yourself, it's a little bit of trial and error. Typically what we would suggest is start with the frequency allocation tables in Part 2. We have a reference here to Part 106. That typically will list all the different frequencies of operations that devices can operate on. It does not list, though, the unlicensed devices that typically fall under Part 15. But a lot of your licensed devices and everything else you're going to find under the frequency allocation tables. They even mention some ISM equipment from Part 18 and whatnot. Then kind of once you have a feeling, if you know it's licensed or unlicensed, that definitely helps, of course, and a lot of that deals with the power levels. If it's a higher power device, more than often than not, it's going to be considered a licensed device. Most of the devices under Part 15 that are unlicensed are fairly low power. You can go up to a couple watts, usually EIRP at least, for maybe Wi-Fi and things like that, point-to-point systems. But generally speaking, the majority of Part 15 is much lower than that. So if you're dealing with anything that's in watts, typically you're going to fall under licensed rule parts. Then you can browse the various rule parts based on what you find out of Part 2 and typically find a description of what's permitted for your particular bands of operation. If you're dealing with Part 15, we have to look very carefully because there are specific rules for frequencies of use. But occasionally, some people, there's a section that's just general, and you don't have to meet any of the particular requirements under specific subsections. They're general requirements. However, there are general restrictions that you can't operate in restricted bands. Restricted bands are just a bottom line no-no, and you can't operate in those under Part 15. You can also, many times, if you have a competitor, go to a competitor's website, get an idea from looking at their documentation, and even go to the FCC site many times, and if you have some basic information, look up their application and do some comparisons to what you're trying to do. And then from there, we commonly, as a certifier, I know the labs get questions. When I was in the lab, we got questions constantly. We many times would go to the certification bodies or FCCs, even from the lab. But typically speaking, it doesn't hurt to go get some expertise from your local lab. If you have a particular person within your company that deals with compliance or a specific division with expertise, going to them. Certification body, many times, even when you start dealing with special devices that are new or breaking technology bounds, you may even need to go to legal counsel, sometimes the FCC directly, but we have many cases where we actually say, we suggest going to the FCC through your legal counsel, just because of the nature of breaking the mold, so to speak. So real quickly, just to go over some of the rule parts that are common that are in the CFR. Part 2, we mentioned earlier, where it has some of the general administrative filing requirements, marketing requirements, and so forth. I'm going to kind of go through this quickly because we've mentioned them briefly. Part 2, there's the sorry here. Part 15, if you're looking for specific types of things that are common, 15.101 to 15.123 has most of your non-intentional radio devices, in other words, non-transmitting devices. This is where you would go for anything that's what's called a digital device, typically under the definitions of the rules. Anything with an oscillator that exceeds 9 kilohertz is usually subject to Part 15, even when it's non-transmitting. And most of the basic requirements fall under Subpart B, which is the 100 series of Part 15. So this is where you would go to look at specific types of things that might fall under that, or requirements, limits, and such. Getting into the unlicensed transmitters, we have 15.225. That's where you're going to find your typical 13.56 transmitters that we hear quite a bit about. 15.231 are garage door openers and similar types of devices for momentary operation of control. A lot of your vehicle systems, your tire pressure sensors operate in this frequency bands that are allowed in there as well. You'll notice that they say here that you are allowed to operate from the 40.66 to the 40.70 and greater than 70 megahertz. So they don't lock down a particular band of operation, but this does not necessarily mean you can operate in any frequency you want. You've got to take into consideration the 15.205 restricted bands of operation that you cannot operate in when you're looking at these. There's 15.245 for field disturbance sensors. Generally, they cover a couple of different ranges listed here. 15.247 is probably one of the most common ones in recent years. That's where all your Wi-Fi and typical higher power unlicensed devices are operating at. 15.247 does lock your devices more or less down, though, having to meet either a DTS type of operation or a frequency hopping system of operation, both which the FCC does have some definitions that have to meet to be able to qualify here. If you, for some reason, can't qualify under 247 because you're not following the hopping requirements that they spell out or something, you can go under 15.249. They do have a slightly different frequencies that are allowed there as well. You'll notice they include a 24 gigahertz, some requirements there for that. But generally speaking, they are much lower power. So there's kind of a trade-off where you can use any type of modulation. You don't have to follow hopping requirements, things like that, but you are limited in your power. 15.401 to 407, typically that's your uni devices. We call them uni anyway, but the public kind of knows them as the 5 gigahertz band for Wi-Fi in many cases. 15.401 to 407 covers a lot of those requirements spelled out there, and there's different bands of operation. 5150 to 5250 is band 1 and other bands, but generally those requirements cover all those bands. We hear a lot in recent years too about UWB devices, ultra wideband devices is what that stands for. And there's specific requirements there. I think I have a typo. but it starts at section 15.501 and probably goes up to, I believe, 555 is what that should be. There are some other bans that were not mentioned, of course, here, or specific type of devices that are unlicensed. I just tried to cover some of the more common ones that we hear about. Some other important sections about unlicensed devices under Part 15 if you're using that subpart. Generally, the subparts are broken into Part A, B, C, and forward. Generally, Part A is 0 through 99. Subpart B, I mentioned a few minutes ago, is a 100 section, and so forth. Subpart A is general requirements that apply across the board. Generally, they're definitions. There's some labeling requirements. They mention how to make measurements on multiple channels of equipment. In other words, high, mid, and low channels in certain instances. The band of the entire band of operation that you need to test a device to based on its fundamentals. There's a lot of general requirements that are spelled out here, and that's where you go to look at your general requirements that are a catch-all for everything else that you do. 15.203, if you're dealing with transmitters, has antenna requirements that have to be met for Part 15. Generally, it should be a non-standard connector. You can't just use a standard connector under Part 15 rules. We get a lot of questions still about what's considered a non-standard connector, and that's kind of a small aside by itself that we can get into if someone was interested. 15.204 discusses external amplifiers and antenna modifications. In other words, how much, if I want to change my antenna, what do I do in some cases? If I want to add an external amplifier, can I do that under Part 15? There are some very limited requirements for doing that, and I suggest you look at that section of the rules if you're interested in selling a system that includes an external amplifier under Part 15. 15.212 is a common one today. It deals with modular transmitter certifications, authorization requirements. We've heard a lot about modules. They came out roughly in the mid-90s. We started seeing small companies deal with it. The FCC codified some rules for them and eventually put them under 212 of the rules, and that's a very common requirement for a lot of people today. Still a lot of questions about modules, and the FCC is looking at updating that. I'll get a little bit more into modules a little bit later in the presentation. Just real quickly, some example of common rule parts: 22H for cellular devices, Part 27C, 24, that's where a lot of the LTE falls. Part 90 is where you have a lot of your private mobile LAN radio services. Part 95, I haven't really mentioned yet, but that's where you find some of your other types of services like CB, your family radio services, the GMRS bands, paging, some radio control for certain types of devices, wireless medical devices and such. Bear with me, I don't know if I skipped a slide or not, but it looks like we're okay. Okay. Essentially, you know, we want to find your requirements in the rules, and the requirements in the rules typically are spelling out your parameters for your transmitters, your powers, your bandwidths, the bands of operation, your spurious emissions, and things like that. But there are situations where the FCC wants you to come to them before you get involved in testing. Due to various reasons, especially in new technology or specific RF exposure situations, they typically want the applicant to try to touch base with them prior to even going to the lab in many cases, or the lab to at least communicate with them prior to testing. Essentially, there's a particular KDB that's you can go search for, and we mentioned the KDB system earlier, but it's not only used to submit questions to the FCC, but as I was trying to mention earlier, there's a huge amount of knowledge database and interpretations or policies, procedures, methods, and things that the FCC has published there. You can search by KDB number directly. You can do keyword searches and whatnot. But here we have the KDB number that you would want to go look for specifically checking to make sure my device doesn't fall under something I need to communicate with the FCC prior to actually doing my testing. And real quickly, this KDB, this is where you would find it. When you actually get there and you look it up, you'll notice there's not much text. Let me see if I can put on a laser pointer here. Essentially, you got a real simple answer of what, sometimes a quick summary or an explanation under the KDB, but you'll see links here in this area right here. In this case, there's two of them, but some of those are very lengthy documents. They're links to documents that the FCC can change at any time. And typically, we used to send our clients a copy of the documents when they had questions via email, but we've come to discover that's always a bad idea because the FCC can change them at any time. It's better to provide you the links and let you be able to make sure you're getting the most current information by going directly to the links themselves. So essentially, you go to the rules, you figure out a little bit about what's required for my device, but then you have to go to a test and do testing the device. Essentially, this presentation is not really getting into a lot of the test requirements or things. There's a few brief things I'm going to mention, but that's something that would be a whole presentation in itself, probably even a couple hours. But one of the things is you typically are going to have a selection of a test lab. Sometimes manufacturers and things will do this themselves through their own testing. But I wanted to caution everybody that there's been new requirements that were issued in 2015 that have been postponed, but as we are expected as of July 12th of this year, that everything that's submitted, at least for a certification authorization, does need to go through an recognized accredited test lab for the FCC. And the scope of the testing itself that's done has to actually be part of the laboratory scope. You can't just go to an accredited lab because they're accredited and they test something that's not on their scope. It wouldn't be accepted, at least after July 12th, by any sort of organization reviewing the test report under their authorizations. So quickly, what you would do is after you have testing done, you have to go through an authorization typically. There are different types of authorizations. In short, the authorization process is the FCC's way to ensure that RF devices stay within the rules. All RF devices must comply with the FCC technical requirements before you legally ship, sell, import, or offer for sale in the United States. There are 4 basic routes for authorizations. One is nothing's required. One's a verification. There's a declaration of conformity and a certification. Many of these authorizations are more than just a test report. Many times it's a compilation of various documents that are necessary to show compliance. In some cases you keep them on record. In other cases you submit them through an agency for review. But in short, I know Greg Schumack is giving a presentation through this series next week, and he will get into a lot more detail, especially in the certification route, which tends to be the more lengthy set of documents that you would need under these authorizations. The ins and outs and pluses and minuses of what to do, not do, and things like that. Can you choose any of these authorizations? Unfortunately, no. The rules themselves typically dictate what type of authorizations you are allowed to do. It all depends on what rule parts you're under. But under Part 15, for instance, sometimes there's actually even a choice. You'll notice here there's types of devices. This, I believe, comes from Part 15.101 of the rules. If you're a super regenerative receiver, you notice they even categorize receivers under different types: TV, FM, CB, super regen, scanning receiver, and such. Some of these have different types of authorizations that can be done. You'll notice a lot of these are verification. There's also declaration of conformity in some, and some of them actually allow for certification, optionally. But when you go to other rule parts, like under the license bands of operation and the transmitters, even under 15C, the majority of them will actually just more or less say they have to be certified. 15 subpart C, for instance, they mention everything's subject to certification with a very narrow exception. There's an exception in there about very low frequency devices that meet the limits by 40 dB and so forth. But in short, the rules should dictate what type of authorization is necessary. Multiple authorization routes can apply as well. So what we want you to make you aware of is if I have a product that, for instance, has a Wi-Fi device and a cellular device and it's a PC peripheral, you actually are suddenly subject to 3 different sections of the rules, at least. 15B for the PC peripheral aspect of it. Wi-Fi would fall under 15247, and your cellular would fall under the license bands of operation. Could be Part 22, 24, 27. But in short, you can be subject to multiple authorizations, not just one. You don't just pick the worst case. You have to comply with all the requirements under each. There are some small rollover exceptions to labeling and things that could maybe be done in some instances, but in general, you need to be aware. You have to look at your device, determine what's in my device and what's going to apply to it. Just due to time limitations, we can't really get into the details of authorizations and things that are necessary. But Part 2 of the rules do discuss in detail a lot of the, if you're verification, what's required, certification, what's required, and so forth. FCC certification requirements, just briefly, used to be that you could submit directly to the FCC or a TCB. TCBs came in development roughly in the early 2000s. They're more or less a privatized version of review process that does what the FCC does, and then they publicly post through the FCC site your certifications. However, as of this 2015 changes to the rules, one of the requirements that came out, or policy changes that came out, is that the FCC is no longer going to be directly reviewing these applications. So the function is now 100% under the TCB private section. We do certain types of devices we do have to do in cooperation with the FCC. Many times you have to go to the FCC first, as I mentioned, through the KDB process, and you provide documentation of that to us as part of our review process. But next, so what happens when I actually go to certify my product? You've done your testing, you've assembled these documents that are required for authorization. You typically submit those to a TCB. You can do those through your laboratory. Many times the labs will offer that process to you. You can do them directly yourself. You can use an agent. Sometimes people hire an agent to work with the lab to make sure everything's going smoothly and so forth. Any of those processes is sufficient, just depends what works for your organization. And then the TCB will review all the documentation you provided, compare it to all the requirements that need to be met, as well as their requirements for their accreditations that have to be met. And in the end, if there's any concerns, discrepancies, questions, they work with you to resolve those. And when they are complete, they eventually will post everything through the FCC site and issue a grant of authorization. Let's see here. This is a typical example of a grant that you receive. Of course, I tried to redact the information of who this was particularly for at the time. But essentially, this is a sample of what the TCB would provide to you. If you go to the FCC site yourself and directly pull one of these, it's actually not going to have the logo down there. Usually it says copy or something to that effect on it. So usually the TCB is providing back to their client a final copy that's considered the version of the main version. Let me just see here. This one is a Part 15 device. It's a fairly simple device. It looks like it's a 15231 device with one frequency of operation. Very simple. I also wanted to provide you a more complicated one for cellular that has all sorts of bands of operations. You will notice toward the bottom of this, not only does it have a large number of rule parts that it's subjected to, the right-hand side shows different emission designators which deal with the different types of transmission it's capable of. There may be some grant notes at the very bottom underneath, which many times are limitations or informative regarding what the device is capable of or not capable of, whether it's a modular approval, RF exposure limitations, maybe some information like it operates as a 2x2 MIMO device. There's all sorts of things that can be down there that are important to consider. So I just wanted to show you a quick example of both a simple and a complicated one. But many times you want to go look at your application online with the FCC. As part of the process of issuing this grant to you, the TCB is also going to upload all the documents, the final documents that were provided for the review process to the FCC. A majority of those are publicly accessible. Only certain ones can actually be considered confidential and hidden from public view. But briefly, I wanted to show you here how you can go look on the FCC site. This is the link to go there, and what you would do is if you're doing a search, it could be by frequency, by company, by type of authorization, like the subpart it's under, even the TCB that issued it. It just depends on what you're looking for in particular. If you're looking for a competitor, you probably start with their name. But you go to this website, you would enter the information there. Typically from there, you would get a search. In this case, I only showed a part of it. You'll see this particular search, as an example, had 360 responses back because it was a very general search. But I just showed you the top part that kind of shows you what kind of information you get back, and I redacted the specific clients and things that were involved here. But I wanted to show you a little bit is how to find the information if you're trying to research a competitor and go get the information from the FCC site. If you go to this link here and press where it says Display Grant, you should get a copy of the grant that was actually issued, or as I showed a few minutes ago. In some cases, in the devices that cover multiple rule parts, like a cellular device plus a unlicensed Part 15 device, there may even be multiple grants issued under a single ID number. So you may have to look at the right-hand side for the frequencies of operation and correlate them to the grant and make sure you get all the grants that are associated with it. If you go to this section here on the left for display exhibits, there's a detail and a summary. Essentially, the detail will actually allow you to physically view the exhibit itself that was provided to the FCC. So if you wanted to see photographs, excuse me, you wanted to see their test data, anything like that, you can go and look at the detailed link of there and upload, or excuse me, download each one of those links and view them yourself if you desire. But sometimes there are documents that are confidential and not allowed to be shown. Usually that is part of their authorization. You have a specific request that has to be submitted covering specific documents. The FCC does not allow you to do all documents. There's only specific ones that are allowed as well. But generally speaking, here's an example. If you look very quickly on the right-hand side, you'll see dates not available for certain types of exhibits like the block diagram, circuit descriptions, maybe the schematics and things like that. And that basically means they were uploaded as a confidential document. So you can get a complete list of what was actually provided in your authorization. And next week, of course, Greg's supposed to go into more detail what to expect with these exhibits and how to make a good filing. I guess quickly jump into Canada, because we haven't even mentioned Canada just yet. Canada in a nutshell. A lot of people, especially for outside the United States, commonly think of North America as just one process with two sets of paperwork, and that's because the processes with Canada are very similar. There are different documents that are needed, different forms, and different cover letters and things. There's not a harmonized overall approach for all the countries in North America, but most people, when they talk about North America, they're concerned, of course, with the FCC for the USA and then Canada, which we used to call IC, and I still use that nomenclature constantly, but it's actually now ISED, I-S-E-D. So the reason we have to consider them, there are differences in the paperwork. They are a different country, so sometimes their opinion of the documents and interpretations are a little bit different, but there are quite a few things that are very similar. So in short, we just wanted to go over, for Canada, they do have to have equipment authorizations for a lot of devices, just like the FCC. You're submitting those to ISED, as we mentioned here, and this is what it stands for, the Innovation, Science, and Economic Development Canada Bureau. Many of their documents that are still published for the test standards or test requirements and things still actually have IC references. I still think they're under the IC umbrella ultimately, but their name is actually changed to ISED for that particular bureau. But the standards are nice because they're free offline. They're much simpler and easier to read than typically the FCC, at least to find information. So here's a few quick how they're like the FCC and how they're not like the FCC. So in short, the transmitters are subject to certification just like the FCC in most cases. Many of the tests are actually the same. Many of the bands of operation are the same. Test methods many times are the same as well. Powers limits are also usually the same in many cases. There are specific types of transmitters where they differ. There are a few transmitter types, I think, that are not even certifiable in Canada that the FCC might allow. But all the general ones that we typically deal with, through Zigbee, Wi-Fi, and things like that, they are very, very close to what the FCC would require. Generally speaking, you would have to create a quick matrix as part of your process comparing the FCC to IC, or you have a test report that covers both automatically. Would be part of the test and measurement comparison requirements. But how they're not like the FCC, in short, they have standards. They're not just one big, huge book of rules. They're typically much easier to read as well, much shorter. The whole application process is a little bit different. They require their own forms, their own letters. There actually is more form letters and things that have to be provided to Canada than to the FCC in their applications. They also require you to use a Canadian certification body, a foreign certification body if they're outside of Canada, not a TCB like the FCC does. However, most TCBs are also an FCB or a Canadian certification body as well. There are a few that are not, but generally speaking, the idea is you do have to make sure you're using the proper body that can do certification work if you're submitting those. Many non-intentional radiators in the U.S. that would be subject to verification, DOC, or certification, they may actually only be verification in some instances in Canada as well. So you kind of have to go look at the verification requirements. A lot of those are given in a document called RSS Gen in Canada. Also, for labeling purposes, we really haven't gotten into manual labeling in this presentation due to time requirements, but there are some differences. And for Canada, not only do they require a certification number on the device, just like the FCC would, they also have an HVIN requirement. It used to be known as a model number requirement. The HVIN requirement should be on the device. It does not have to be preceded by the term HVIN, but something has to match, at least as part of the application and what we put on record with Canada on their site. And of course, the HVIN must be correct in the label that you provide to us for review, and the manufacturer cannot usually change that without doing some sort of application process, depending on the nature of the changes, whether they're adding a model, getting a new certification number, things like that may change the type of authorization that's done. They do have some dual language requirements, especially in the user's manual. There's certain sections, all the compliance statements in the manuals have to be both in French and English. It's not something the FCC would require typically, of course. You also have to have an in-country representative. If you're a manufacturer that's actually in Canada, you don't have to have the rep, of course, or an applicant that's in Canada because you're already located in Canada. But if you're an applicant from outside of the Canadian market, then you have to have some sort of in-company representative, and that has to be part of the process and documented. You have to have a letter from them and so forth. A unique requirement for Canada is everyone's usually involved in the application process, and that's your test lab, your agent, your certification body, your Canadian rep. Even the manufacturers are supposed to be on record with Canada. It's a simple process of sending an email to them. We can provide you that information if you need it. But they have to be registered and they have a number that's given to them that's used as part of our processes of putting stuff on file with them. And here's just some common standards in Canada, similar to what we listed for FCC. You have RSS 247 is similar to 15 Part 247. They try to make the numbers similar. However, in this case, they also cover the 5 gigahertz requirements for FCC, which are typically found under Part 15, the 400 sections under the UNI devices. RSS 210 typically covers a lot of the subpart C types of transmitters that you find for Part 15. They've also combined it with a few others, like I think the FRS radios and GMRS radios and things. But in general, you probably look under RSS 210 for other types of unlicensed devices if you're interested. Cellular devices, you would start looking at your documents, the RSS 130, 132, 133, and 139. Bear with me for 1 second here. So similar to the FCC, once things are posted on the site, you can go view the applications. One of the differences, though, is you cannot see the documents. You can only see the information similar to the FCC that you would see in a grant. You can go do a search similar to the FCC as well. Here's a link for you. You go to the bottom of the page and do in the radio equipment list, you use the search tools and look for the information. However, exhibits and particular documents uploaded and things like that will not be found on the Canadian site. Changing a certification. Many times companies have variants of a product. Of course, you have things that change over time. You find out something didn't quite work like you wanted and you want to fix it. It could be adding some changes to it. You may want to change the color, things like that. So in Canada, they are more interested in the HVIN numbers and things, so sometimes you need to communicate with your lab or certification body regarding the variants that you're going to have and take that into consideration, especially for Canada more than the FCC. The FCC, many of these can simply be explained and included in an application, depending on them. But if you're changing them at a later point in time after your certification is done, we start getting concerned with what we call a permissive change. And a permissive change does have a specific definitions that have to be met under Part 2 of the rules. I can lead you there if you have an interest at a later time. But essentially, the device sometimes may require a new certification. Sometimes you can do a permissive change. And many times clients will argue, but it still passes. It's so close to what it is. Well, it's not changed that much. It just depends. There's legal issues involved because of your authorizations and how the FCC documents and keeps these things on record. So we have to go back and make sure if you're making changes, it meets the requirements under permissive change requirements. It's really all about tracing the product when you're doing permissive change, and this is why sometimes certain things are not allowed. The agencies have certain things that they will allow and not allow during the permissive change process. So a little bit about permissive changes in general. If you have changes that do not affect the radio performance, most of these will typically fall under a permissive change pretty easily, unless the product is defined as a new product or has a whole new functionality. You may be dealing with some issues there. But essentially, that's one of the easy things. There is a Class 1, Class 2, Class 3, which I'm going to get to here in a few pages, that defines what you actually do with your authorizations based on the type of change, if the change is allowed. So the first thing you need to do, though, there is a policy by the FCC that provides great guidance. It's I think it's roughly a 7-page document in their KDB system here. Part 2 of the rules will give you some general definitions of what's allowed, but these are detailed in much more. Yes, you can do this. You've got to do it this way, or you've got to classify as a Class 2, and so forth in their guidance here, given them just KDB, the 178919 specified here. Generally, excuse me, most permissive changes fall under Class 1 or a Class 2 change. There is actually a Class 3 change. But generally, Class 1 changes are changes that if the device does not go beyond what was reported in the original documentation, and it still falls under the definition of a permissive change as well. Usually you can do a Class 1 change. That does not typically require an application to be submitted to the FCC, TCB, or to Canada. That's something that you would be responsible for keeping on record, because if the FCC did come back and say, we noticed your product is not matching what was reported in the marketplace under our system, and you would have to produce proof of showing you've tested it and everything else just to make sure it's compliant. In some cases, testing may not be necessary. I mean, for instance, a simple color change and things like that. But in general, you should have documentation internally to say somebody's made a decision what it categorizes as a Class 1 change versus a Class 2. Class 2 is typically done when there is something that has changed or gotten worse in your documentation, or maybe it's a type of change. If you go to that KDB, sometimes certain types of changes they still want put on record with the FCC as a Class 2 change. I mean, for instance, if you lower power and you do it in software only and the user's not doing that, you're selling it at a different power level for a particular reason. I think one of the requirements in the permissive change policy in some cases is actually you still need to do a Class 2 change to put it on record, even though you're lowering power and it's not worse than it was before. So that's why you want to go back to that KDB and kind of review what it allows and not allows. And in short, if you're doing Class 2 permissive change, it's going to have to go through a review process, usually with your TCB, and then post it to the FCC site. You shouldn't be selling it, of course, until the application is complete. Just for the sake of time here, I'm going to go a little bit faster. Class 3 changes typically are things that deal with firmware. They're only associated with SDRs, which we very rarely see, but I wanted to mention that there's a Class 3 change in case you're interested. We're going to just skip ahead here to Canada. Canada has very similar requirements. In fact, if you look at them, they're almost identical, but there's a lot less detail about their Class 1 and Class 2 changes. Under some very rare instances, we've seen where IC requires a Class 2 and the FCC would allow a Class 1. When in doubt, that's when we say, communicate with your lab or TCB as appropriate. Essentially, for Canada, you can make minor changes to the transmitter part, but everything has to be minimum. There can be layout changes and things as well. It's very similar to the FCC. IC does identify both a Class 3 and a Class 4 change as well that deal usually with modules. Class 3 is when you have firmware or not. Well, Class 3 is not always modules, but essentially if you have a firmware change or something that affects the RF, they want you to do a Class 3 in general. And then they also have a Class 4, which deals with modules put in particular hosts. And RF exposure is usually a main concern, and that's when they bring that into play. Canada, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes when you have multiple models and variants, you have to actually address what's called a family certification. And that's usually can sometimes be included if you know it up front. Sometimes you come back and do a family addition at a later time. It affects both your labeling, maybe your HVIN numbers, or the variants of types of products that you're offering in the market. Sometimes they can't be grouped and they have to be separate and independent. So we're going to jump ahead now to introduction of transmitter modules. In short, this is a big thing in the past 10 years. A lot of people are wanting to go wireless, of course. So why do we always discuss modules? It's a wired world, essentially, and everything's going to like the Internet of Things, machine-to-machine compatibilities. Everything's having Wi-Fi and WLAN and everything else. And not everybody wants to become an expert in wireless transmission, so they rely on integrating some sort of transmitter module. There are allowances for doing modular approvals. Essentially, a module is typically defined as a complete RF transmission subassembly. It's designed to be incorporated into another device and demonstrate compliance with the FCC rules or IC rules and policies independent of a host. So you can put it in a host. But this does create complexities with your authorization process, excuse me, especially with RF exposure and things like that. That's essentially what we just talked about. So I know the FCC and IC have had clear modular approval routes over for many years. Unfortunately, a lot of that might be changing right now, and we got a lot of concern with a debate by the FCC where how to implement the modules and whether retesting has to be done. The whole idea behind modules is many times when a company doesn't want to be become an expert in it, they can actually utilize a module without having to do a design of their own, as well as a lot of retesting or authorization work. But the FCC came out this past October and mentioned that they start wanting the integrators even to redo a lot of testing. However, they've not codified that. Their policies still say specifically, at least as of the past few days, that you do not have to do retesting when you meet all the requirements that are spelled out in their policies to start with. So what I suggest is there's a lot of discussion with the TCP Council and TCPs. A lot of this is subject to change this year. We also probably in the next 2 or 3 weeks have another TCP conference with the FCC where they may be announcing the new requirements. But this is a big game changer for a lot of people, and we definitely suggest if you're using or considering modules that you closely monitor that KDB that's mentioned here on this page. So there are full modular approvals. There are limited modular approvals. In short, I'm going to skip ahead here due to time. This is where you would go to get some guidance, and there's a whole bunch of information. There's 2 documents there. There's 10 pages of detailed discussion, 11 pages of Q&A that help if you're interested in using modules. And if you're an integrator especially, you want to familiarize yourself with this as well, even if you're not doing the authorization work. And monitor these on an ongoing basis, knowing that there's possible changes coming forth this year. And to do modular approvals, just in short, there are 8 basic requirements given 15.2.12. They're briefly listed here, but there's shielding, there's buffering, there's antenna requirements, RF exposure requirements, and there usually has to be cover letters that address a lot of this information as part of your authorization process. This is just saying that you have to include a cover letter to cover those 8 items. We have to evaluate that with the authorization you provide and everything as a certification body. So if you're integrating the module as a company that's not doing authorization or the original design work, in the past and up till now, you can rely on the certification work done in most cases, as long as you're not making any changes, as long as you're labeling your host under the requirements to show it has a module in it. You still should be getting a module that has a label on it as well, in most cases. And you do not necessarily have to retest for the transmitter requirements. In the past, though, you still have had to retest in a non-transmit state because there's no guarantee that the combination of the transmitter or the module in your device is still going to have any other issues. So usually you have to do the subpart B or the non-transmitting test requirements. But now, of course, the FCC is starting to talk about even redoing some of the transmitter requirements. So in past, or at least up till now, you can just typically do a Part 15B verification or a DOC to make sure that there's no additional concerns with your device integrating it in the transmitter into your device. And let's see here, but this is another reminder again that you may have to start taking consideration transmitter tests as well. And this is a big thing for industry because many times you as an integrator, you're not wanting to fool with the transmitter authorization. You're not wanting to have to spend time and money on it. This can be very expensive, especially in the cellular world, depending on what kind of guidance the FCC ends up giving. But there's a whole slew of concerns, and the TCP Council is communicating with the FCC. They've actually formed a group that's actually discussing this as we speak over the last few months. And I just say stay tuned and watch these KDBs. If you have any interest in getting involved in these committees to voice your opinion, I can provide you information outside of this presentation on who to get involved with and how to do that. So if you don't meet all 8 requirements, there is something known as limited modular approval, and I'll just go throw that out. Sometimes you don't have a shield installed over the device, or sometimes maybe the you don't have a regulator on board with the transmitter module. And in some cases, you can do what's called a limited modular approval, but in general, usually those are limited to a specific application, specific host, many times limited to the grantee only that does in their products. Just kind of depends, but there is some processes that can be done in some cases to still get an approval on the devices. Shield is one of the toughest ones when there's no shield, because that pretty much means you have to retest everything anyway because the shielding is not present in the host it's going into. IC has very similar type of modular requirements. RSP 100 contains a lot of the information that's needed for that. Their labeling requirements are also very similar. You have to show it has a label on the host that it contains a modular transmitter, and this is just some examples of that there. A similar letter has to be submitted for Canada. They have a specific form they like to see that's actually located, I think, in the RSP 100, the back of it. Most of the TCVs will provide you a copy of that form or their version of it. Let's see, Canada has limited modular, contains information. So to jump real quick to RF exposure, RF exposure is also part of most of these authorizations that we have to do. It is become almost bigger than the typical transmitter test requirements in the past 10 years. It is a huge thing. Training on it many times takes more than a day, a couple days in some cases if you've never gone through any of it. But RF exposure, I just want to touch on briefly because many times you have to include information in your authorizations that deal with RF exposure. Sometimes they're simple calculations. However, in complex cases or portable cases, many times if exemptions aren't met, you have to have specific tests done. And sometimes, not all labs are capable of doing RF exposure on site. A lot of times they have to use other labs that specialize in it, depending on the nature of the device, product, frequency range, and so forth. So just to touch briefly on what RF exposure is, it's how much energy is associated with being received by the human body from a device that's used. There's both something called SAR and MPE. SAR is when something's portable or closer than 20 centimeters to the body during normal use. It can be body worn or just used in close proximity in most cases. MPE is more of something when in far field in most cases, or at least greater than 20 centimeters from the human body. It can be something that's mounted on your roof. It can be on your fixed tower down the road, cell tower, and so forth. There are a general guidance document, 447498, that discusses RF exposure. It's about I want to say an 18-page document offhand. Fairly complicated to understand if you've not gotten into the world, but that is your general starting point for most things under FCC for RF exposure. For IC or ICED, it's RSS 102. It comes under the umbrella of Safety Code 6, and they have some basic information, of course, there. They deal with both exemption levels and things that deal with, if you meet exemption levels, you don't have to actually include much more information, too complex information about what needs to be tested. Here, the guidance from the FCC under Part 2 of the rules is where they start more or less pinpointing that MPE is required for mobile and fixed devices, and of course SAR is required for portable devices. And there's some basic information there. They do reference some test standards and so forth, but a huge amount of this information is really found under the KDB process for the FCC. ICED also has some new requirements that came out this March. They're what's called nerve stimulation that the FCC has not really pushed just yet in most cases, but anything that falls in the frequency range of a fundamental of the transmitter from 3 kilohertz to 10 megahertz now has to have documentation to show support to SPR-002, in addition to the general RSS 102 that some people might be familiar with already. There are exemptions, but for the exemptions, I would say refer to the standards themselves. They are not the same between Canada and the FCC. There are similarities in certain areas, but in some cases, IC is more stringent than the FCC. And currently, there is no exemptions for the nerve stimulation requirements. There are somebody could argue that the nerve stimulation requirements are given in RSS 102. as part of it, but then you go to another standard and it says RSS 102 is exempt, but those particular types of devices are falling in this frequency range, and we have confirmed with Canada directly that, unfortunately, as of right now, if you fall in that range, there is no such thing as an exemption. You've got to produce documentation for it. The complexities of all the requirements in the background, if they go beyond simple exemptions, there's all sorts of testing that can be involved. Here's just a sample list of the KDBs, depending on whether you're a WiMAX device, a Wi-Fi device, in a laptop, in a cell phone, an occupational radio. There's all sorts of SAR, RF exposure information that is quite detailed, quite complex to get involved with, that may have to be covered. And this is when it's good to give reliance, of course, of your local lab or a SAR facility if you're needing that. And of course, for SAR, ISED does accept a lot of the same KDBs that the FCC generates. There are some minor differences. And in general, they have a publishment on this page, on this link here, where they say we do accept these KDBs from the FCC. However, they accept a lot of the reductions, the test reductions many times that are given in these documents. But when you have an exemption in a KDB by the FCC, but IC's exemption is different, you have to go by the IC document for the exemption. So many times IC might even require you to test, and the FCC might not in some instances. So you just have to be familiar with those. And then, of course, just quickly, integration of modules by manufacturers. You have to consider any RF exposure conditions for your integrated host. And sometimes these actually mean you have to go back, and if you're using it outside of what the authorization may have allowed, or you're going to a portable situation, you may have to actually go back and do an authorization process with either agencies, FCC or ISED, depending on what you have. What I did is try to summarize many of the links that were used, not all. On this page, here's some FCC, and then on the next page, some ICs, so try to localize a lot of that for you. And that concludes, hopefully in a nutshell. It looks like it ran over a little bit, but just trying to give a real basic overview and understanding of how a lot of these things tie together.
Well, Greg, that was quite a presentation, a lot of information. I did get a couple of questions in. If you could bear with us for a couple more minutes. I got a comment here. So this is to confirm. Guidance as of today, one does not have to retest radiated spurious of the module installed in the final host.
Can you repeat that one more time for me, please?
As of today, one does not have to retest radiated spurious of the module installed in the final host. That's in the form of a confirmation question. Yeah,
I think that's still going to depend on a few different things. If you're looking at just a single module in a device, as of a few days ago, I know the FCC in October says they want to see retesting. But then if you can go to their KDB system and show where their documents say if you use a module and you've met all the requirements, no further testing is necessary. I would say today, if we're looking at today, I have to go back and look at that KDB to be absolutely positively certain. We know that the FCC is pushing toward and wanting you to test that and make the integrator responsible for it. However, given the guidance that's published that says you don't have to do it, until that publisher's statements are revoked, you don't necessarily have to do that. Now, it gets more complicated, though, if you start putting multiple modules in a device, because if you have multiple modules or multiple transmitters in a device, there is guidance from the FCC that says you are responsible for looking at intermodulation and other things as well. So that is not necessarily superseded. I'm really referring to just a single module and a use of a single module at this point in time. So when you get into the complexities of more than that, we probably want to talk to them more directly.
Okay, good. General question, has the implementation of the Radio Equipment Directive had an effect of FCC processes and KDB answers?
Wow. We're seeing a ton of questions on red, and I am not a red expert by any means. I'm more dangerous in that area. When I was in the lab, I did a lot of EU work and so forth, but right now my focus has been North America and Hong Kong and a few other places. I have not personally seen questions come in from the red that translate over to the FCC and really affect the FCC North America questions and concerns that we have at this point in time. But I do know red, there's a ton of questions coming in, and it's unbelievable the amount of things that people think are not really changing that might be changing. I do know Michael Darby, I think, is supposed to be giving a presentation on this in a few weeks through this series.
2 weeks
Okay.
from now.
Yeah, and I've actually sat through probably what's going to be a very similar presentation. Me and Michael were in Asia back in January, and let me tell you, it's very informative. I learned a lot just because I've been out of the EU stuff for a while, but even the stuff that people thought they didn't have to deal with, there's a lot changing that they may not be aware of. So just to throw that out. But no, for FCC and IC, I'm not really seeing that have a direct effect here.
Okay. I got going to hopefully deal with one more here. Does KDB decisions get incorporated into the rule parts, and if they're not incorporated, do they expire?
Do they expire? Well, there's changes constantly in the KDB system. I think in some instances they may get developed into the rule parts over time. I mean, just one example that I can kind of think of off the top of my head would be there didn't used to be a section 15.212 for modules. It used to be all separate guidance and policies, mostly through the KDB systems, or even before that there was other systems that they had that you could find that information on. However, eventually that did get incorporated in. So yes, it is possible for it to get incorporated into the rules in some instances, but in many instances they don't want to incorporate it into the rules if it's something that can change pretty quickly. And one of the reasons is the FCC can change the KDB and have the authority to change them very quickly or almost immediately, whereas the rules can take years and things like that, so they don't want to lock a lot of stuff down that may be subject to change. Also, do they expire? There's no expiration date given on the KDBs directly, but if you go, I could give you numbers outside of this presentation. I'd have to go look them up, but they recently took 10 different KDBs and incorporated them into a single KDB, so it supersedes all 10. Information in there is subject to change, of course, and be a little bit different. And we have seen some of them actually where they just said they rescinded the KDB for one reason or another, but usually that's because they've covered it in a new one somewhere else in some other way. With, again, the guidance could have changed. So it is important to kind of stay on top of that. But no expiration directly cited that I'm aware of on any of them.
Okay. Do you have any suggestions that would help the file submission to expedite the approval process? Just general things a person might want to consider. Well,
I think that the main thing is being very familiar with the rules up front, knowing what your device can and cannot do, making sure you use a test lab that, especially coming with the July deadline, that meets the recognized accredited requirements. If you're going to a test lab, I would just always recommend maybe quizzing the test lab. Are they familiar with testing this type of device? Because a lot of test labs, they can test all types of devices, but they may not have a huge background in a certain area. It's always a good idea to get a good feel for what their background is. Knowing all the requirements for your authorization, what needs to be submitted. Of course, Greg will be going over that here forthcoming next week. But I will say 60 to 80% of the problems we see to getting an application done quickly are still on the administrative side of things. We do find issues with technical issues. We do find testing issues. But a huge amount of them are still on the administrative side. And, of course, the more correct you can get all that done, the faster it's going to be reviewed and, of course, processed by the TCB to get it up to the FCC site. If you fall into a case where you need pre-compliance information from the FCC directly through that KDB I mentioned early on, the PAG guidance, pre-approval guidance, make sure you have done that, because sometimes we see where somebody has come to the TCB and says we've not gotten that guidance. We go to review the application, we find it's on the PAG list, and suddenly they should have gotten guidance up front. And now not only does that mean that they have to go spend time doing it, but many times they may have done something wrong or not done it to the FCC's expectations. And so if it is on the PAG list, you want to make sure with the fact that you're going and trying to accomplish that up front. Otherwise, you can bet on the backside it's going to slow things down. So that's just a few things off the top.
Well, thank you very much. I see we've ran over time. I want to take just a moment to do a closeout. And again, I want to thank you for your very informative discussion. I do want to show that there's some upcoming training here. A couple of things I do want to point out. As you indicated, Greg Shumack is on next week for the application review. April 19th, a week from today. And product safety kicks off its six-session series next week. Also, a couple of upcoming events, this battery technology thing. We did this in February, and it's been brought back by popular demand. This is quite an interesting four-part series scheduled for September, presented by Battery Universities. Great presentation on batteries and what affects it and how your safety issues need to be addressed. Look for that. A couple of symposium ideas. The product safety series in May 8th that starts up in San Jose, I'm sorry. And August, the Washington, D.C. EMC Society Symposium, week of August 7th. Greg, I'm aware that you're doing a portion of a wireless tutorial presentation there. Excuse me, Tim. You and Greg both are involved in that, so I'm looking forward to that kind of an event. With that, I'm going to see if I did not receive any other questions. Please look at our website for topics and dates. Basically, this concludes our webinar today. On behalf of myself, Tim, and the entire Washington Labs Academy team, I would like to thank you for attending. I will now close the meeting. Thanks again, Tim.
Thank you, Steve.